All right, good evening. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Institute of Politics Speaker Series event, Fires, Floods, and Fuck-Ups, the Ugly Politics of Disasters. My name is Zeenat, and I'm a second-year Master of Public Policy candidate at the Harris School. At the IOP, I'm co-chair of the Illinois Youth Center Bridge Creative Writing Program and the Graduate Liaison on the Student Advisory Board. The topic of this panel hits close to home for me as a survivor of Hurricane Katrina and someone who grew up along the Gulf Coast. Hurricanes have shaped much of my early life. Some of my earliest memories are of evacuating for big hurricanes like Gustav and coming home to find trees through my roof. I'm so sorry. These disasters and the politics surrounding how we prepare, respond, and rebuild impact communities across the country, regardless of political affiliation. We're incredibly lucky to be joined by a panel of experts with firsthand experience navigating the messy, high-stakes world of disaster response. Michael Brown served as director of FEMA during Hurricane Katrina, where he coordinated federal disaster relief and oversaw programs like the National Flood Insurance Program and U.S. Fire Administration. Today, he's the host of The Situation with Michael Brown and The Weekend with Michael Brown on iHeartRadio and Blaze Radio. Carol Pritchett is mayor of Lake Lure, North Carolina, where she has led her community through the devastation and recovery efforts following Hurricane Helene. In addition to her public service, she has over a decade of leadership experience in healthcare consulting and operations. Ángel Knighten is a nationally recognized expert in crisis, risk, and political communications with deep experience leading cross-sector strategies to address the climate crisis. A former Biden-Harris administration official, he led FEMA's Office of External Affairs and co-chaired California's groundbreaking Listos disaster preparedness campaign. He is currently a Truman National Security Project Fellow and a leading LGBTQ plus voice in national security and public affairs. Justin is also one of our IOP Pritzker Fellows this spring. Moderating our discussion today is Zeenat Rahman, Executive Director of the Institute of Politics. Before joining us at UChicago, she held senior positions at the State Department and USAID. Some quick housekeeping before we begin. First, please silence your cell phones. Second, when it's time for Q&A, 2 microphones will be placed in the audience. Please line up and remember that priority for the first questions will go to students. Finally, please make sure to check upcoming IOP events, including the Reality of Immigration and Deportation in Chicago on April 22nd at 5:30 p.m., and the IOP's annual David Broder Journalism Week, which includes a behind-the-scenes chat with the Know Your Enemy podcast on Tuesday, April 29th. You can register for these events and more on the IOP's website. Now, please join me in welcoming to the stage Michael Brown, Mayor Pritchett, Ángel Knighten, and Zeenat Rahman.
Emma's choice of music. Good evening, everybody. Before we start our discussion, we have a short video, so if we can cue up the video, it'll play over there.
We're going to go with 3. Roger. Ready? Gotta take a load. Taking a load.
Trying to get to my 91-year-old grandmother, just make sure she's okay. There's no cell service.
It is like driving through hell itself down here. Literally through hell.
Do you owe citizens an apology for being absent while their homes were burning? And do you regret cutting the fire department budget by millions of dollars, Madam Mayor? Have you nothing to say today?
Well, that is a bracing video to watch, and I think it demonstrates the indiscriminate nature of natural disasters, that it doesn't matter if you're urban, suburban, black, white, rich, poor, it can and does impact all communities. I was wondering if we could just ask the audience, have any of you been directly, you or your family has been directly impacted by a natural disaster? Can I just see a show of hands? I mean, quite a few of you. So we know that natural disaster response has been plagued with issues for years, and today we'll kind of talk about how politics has always infused these tragedies. But before we dive into specific events, I'd love to hear your perspective on why do you think disasters seem to become political flashpoints so quickly, and was that always the case? And we know that disaster response is hard. Why does it become a political liability? Would any of you like to start?
I'd be happy to start with that. Because every disaster well, at least from the perspective of the former Undersecretary of Homeland Security, every disaster involves the President of the United States, one governor, 2 U.S. senators, at least 1 congressman, X number of mayors, X number of county commissioners, X number of state representatives, X number of state senators. So it is by very nature, and every one of those individuals that I just named all know that politics is good theater, good TV, and so they're all going to, with all due respect, Mayor, they're all going to step up and want to make sure that their constituents know that they're on top of things and they're involved and they're helping take care of things. And in a highly polarized political society, that becomes a flashpoint, and I think that's why.
Mayor?
No, I think that's true. I do think that's true. I also think there are so many different parts when you say, is it politically, affected? You've got the federal government, as you said, and the state government. They have to work together. And that's not something that happens in most situations. Right. And they're not because really most of them don't have experience in doing it. So you may have people at the federal level, but as in the state of North Carolina, the state was really not prepared, I think, for a disaster of this size. And so there's that lack of experience. And I think what was even worse probably this year, so it's not necessarily in between different political parties, but it's sometimes, so November, unfortunately, was a bad month for us to have elections this year, because in the state of North Carolina, in particular, we had a change in governors too, and though they were the same party, still that's 2 different people who are leading. So you have one person who's on the way out, transitioning out, you have another person who's just elected, but they're not really the governor yet, and so there's a delay because of that. And then there's just the need for the state and the federal government to work together, and they don't really know what that plan is and how it works, to be honest with you. So I think that politicizes it too.
I think you're right.
Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that the reason why politics gets into disasters is because at the end of the day, disasters have to do with people. And anytime you have something so focused and hyper-focused on people, political interests come to the table with that. Or political fallout, right? If a disaster is handled well, you get a lot of political wins because of it. If a disaster isn't handled well, you experience the consequences. And I think historically, if you look at disasters, and we're talking, I think here, a lot of the comments here are federal declared national disasters, but that's true for a neighborhood in your local community that burnt down because one house caught on fire and spread to a couple homes or an apartment building. It becomes very political for that local community where all disasters end and stop. The final point I'll make on that is, if you look at the landscape over the last 4 years and look into the future of where we see more hazards on the landscape looming large, this is going to become more and more of an issue because disasters aren't getting less frequent. They're not becoming less deadly. And the cost continues to go up. And so you have a perfect recipe: people, cost, death, and severity that is threatening human life moving forward that we have to be really focused on.
And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'll take advantage of your previous role, your recently departed role at FEMA. I think doing just a quick 30-second, what does FEMA do and who are the people involved for the audience is helpful. In some of the comments that you alluded to, all the parties involved, but what happens, how is it declared, and then how is that money dispersed, and to which stakeholders make those decisions?
Okay, well, keep me
all of that in 1 minute or less.
1 minute or less,
Yeah.
Here we go. So all disasters happen at the local level. So when there's a disaster at the local level, it becomes the responsibility of the county and the mayor, local government. When that particular event becomes more catastrophic than they have the capacity for, more costly than they have the capacity for, it bubbles up to the state. The state then comes in with a state declared disaster, which basically opens up authorities and resources to surge to that local community to support their response and how they're going to manage through that crisis. When it becomes bigger than what the state is able to do on their own, then the request from the governor to the president requests a disaster. FEMA has always been a support mechanism to the state. For the state to manage that disaster, for then locals to execute the response. I will say one last plug on FEMA and what FEMA is. FEMA focuses on the before disaster, the during disaster, and the after disaster. Everyone thinks about FEMA in the during disaster because you have helicopters saving people, right? You have a lot of the alarm of national media. But one of the biggest portfolios that the agency has is actually in the before disaster in helping to reduce the risk of all hazards, as well as in the recovery phase after disaster.
Would either of you add any color to that? Do you mostly?
You know I can't resist adding color to
I
that.
can tell by your face.
Add all the color.
That's why I'm asking, yes.
This is a colored conversation.
And the reason I want to add color to it is because my theory is that as he just described it, there's a tendency for local governments and then state governments to become more and more dependent upon the federal government because they see it as the big pocket of money. So you have misallocated priorities at the local level. So rather than buying a new fire truck, for example, or hiring more emergency workers or doing whatever, they'll put it into another program because they always know in the back of their minds that, and we used to call them CNN disasters, that the minute that CNN or any of the cable channels were covering it, that we knew we were going to get a request, that the mayor was going to request the governor, and the governor was going to be calling me, asking for a presidential disaster declaration because, oh my gosh, we looked around, we don't have any money. So where do we get the money? Oh, let's call the feds. The feds will have the money. And I think the more that cycle has continued, the more that people have become reliant upon the federal government. So while that description is absolutely correct, the underlying and unintended consequence that we see based on just stretched government budgets, and I think personally misallocation of some government budgets, there's now more reliance on FEMA and the federal government. So while presidents will quietly reject a disaster declaration, that usually means that the FEMA director and staff is going to go back out to the governor and say, well, we need some additional information in order to justify it so the president can sign off on it. And then ultimately those almost always get executed, and then it becomes a presidential declared disaster, which means that all those federal monies then get to flow in. And it just then, that cycle just starts feeding on itself, I think.
Mayor Pritchett. You're the mayor of Lake Lure.
Well, yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I don't disagree with what you're saying, some parts of it, but I think you have to recognize this is specific to this Hurricane Helene that was in western North Carolina. Western North Carolina is very different than eastern North Carolina, Raleigh, bigger cities like that. So you have a collection of small towns in mountainous areas. Just to give you an example, Lake Lure has a tax-paying base of 1,400 people. So the devastation from Hurricane Helene right now that we have been able to assess is probably going to be $380 million. So it would be absolutely impossible for a municipality of that size to be able to even begin to address any of the costs. And too large for the state too. So there certainly are different situations. And I understand what you're saying about that. You can't be entirely dependent on the federal government, and I do think the states need to pick up some responsibility there and realize that they need to cover some of that. One of the latest things is FEMA no longer is covering the cost share at 100%. Right. So it's now going to be 90% and 10%, hopefully for the states, because the reality is, we need a new dam. Okay, the dam was compromised. That's probably going to be possibly $125, $150 million. Lake Lure, North Carolina certainly couldn't afford 10% of $150 million, and that's only one thing. So there is this sort of puzzle where you put together all the people who fund from different places and you figure out how it works. I think it is a lot of people don't actually understand how FEMA works.
Right. Well,
And they don't understand the responsibility of either of the state or, if it's possible, of the city. But it is a network of people that have to work together, and that's the key, I think, to figure out how you're going to bring these areas back from utter disasters. So.
and it goes quickly to explaining why it gets political so fast, as you all have said. I think of the thing that probably put FEMA or natural disasters on the minds or in the memory of many Americans, and that's Hurricane Katrina, was probably the first time that I ever thought about FEMA. And it struck in August 2005. It was a Category 5 storm. For those of you who are maybe not alive when it happened, it caused catastrophic damage along the Gulf Coast, especially in New Orleans. The levee failures led to 80% of the city flooding. The storms killed over 1,800 people, displaced hundreds of thousands, and caused $125 billion worth of damage. It became one of the deadliest and costliest natural disasters in U.S. history. Michael, you were in the eye of that storm, like literally and politically. And what do you think Katrina taught us this many years on, and what have we still not learned?
Well, I think one of the things that we had done pre-Katrina, we didn't know Katrina was coming, but FEMA had never done catastrophic disaster planning during anybody's tenure, all the way back to James Lee Witt, or even prior to that. No one had done catastrophic disaster planning. So I wanted to do that kind of planning, and I picked 10 scenarios. And my first scenario was, number one was we called it Hurricane Pam, which was a Category 5 hitting New Orleans because it sits as a fishbowl. It's basically underwater all the time except for the levees. My second category was the big one, hitting the San Andreas Fault and destroying, California. But we chose New Orleans because we thought New Orleans was probably of all the states and all the cities the least prepared. So we started this exercise, hired consulting firms, put all this exercise together. And the exercise, this is, Katrina landed in August of 2005. This planning was being done in, say, August of 2004. And the plan, as we literally started the exercise, completely fell apart. The plan itself was a disaster. And so we had to stop and reevaluate, this is a total screw up. This shows you how bad things are. And so we started going through all the process of trying to get New Orleans and Louisiana to start preparing for a Category 5, not knowing, no clue that one was going to hit.
Why did the plan fall apart?
It fell apart because there was a lack of coordination. There was a lack of a formalized decision-making process. There was, at the time, to put it quite bluntly, there were a lot of, I'm not going to be politically correct about it. The emergency manager at the time was under a federal indictment. He was facing corruption charges for having embezzled some FEMA or local, I forget, some money from somewhere. And so the whole infrastructure that New Orleans, or that Louisiana had in dealing with disasters was pretty non-existent. And that exercise exposed all of that. So it exposed the political problems, it exposed the infrastructure problems, it exposed the problems that we had with the dams and the lack of maintenance and everything. And so we started working immediately on all of the facets you can possibly imagine, trying to get the Army Corps of Engineers to recognize that, hey, what you've been doing is not working, trying to get the inspectors general to recognize that, hey, you're not doing the kind of work that needs to be done to hold these folks accountable, trying to get Louisiana itself to recognize that you've got to kind of buck up what you're doing. And to show you you're all smart enough, you're studying the right kinds of things. You know that things in Washington don't happen in a second. Unless politicians want it to happen in a second, then it can. So we started trying to get Congress to allocate the kinds of resources that we needed to start helping New Orleans. I keep saying New Orleans because that's where the focus was, but it was really all of Louisiana. And all of that was taking time. And while that was taking time, that's when Katrina hit. And I'll never forget someone on either the media or maybe a congressman asked me, well, you knew about this in 2004, why didn't you fix everything? And I just remember kind of chuckling to myself, thinking, I think it was some US senator that asked me that question, because I wanted to really say to them, are you really that stupid? because you're the people that are holding up getting the resources and the legislation and the appropriations that we need to start fixing things. And even once you do that, then we have to start implementing those programs, and we're trying to take something that's been building for decades and trying to correct that, which will also take decades, and then boom, it happens in the middle. And I think that sums up, I think, a lot of what people expect of FEMA. It was like, oh, this horrible thing has happened. And remember, we focus on New Orleans, but Hurricane Katrina extended all the way from the Florida Keys, from Monroe County, Florida, all the way through over to Texas. And then not just, and imagine an arc from Monroe County, the Florida Keys, all the way up through, say, Tallahassee, and then going up toward Atlanta, going into Tennessee, Kentucky, all the way back down through Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, parts of Texas. That huge arc is the entire area that was affected by Katrina. So that was the whole part that we were trying to plan for. Because in places like North Carolina, for example, it's not necessarily the hurricane per se, it's not the winds, it's that they tend to get inland, and then the low pressure starts to dissipate, and it turns into a tropical storm, and it just starts dumping water. And so, I mean, the mayor might disagree with me on this, but I would say that most of the devastation that occurred in North Carolina was not from the hurricane winds, from hurricane force winds. It was from all the water and the flash flooding that occurs in the mountains. That's where the devastation occurs. But people don't think about that, and then people don't plan for it in their long-term planning that, oh, we might have a flood. I'll give you a real quick example, then I'll shut up. The Big Thompson Canyon, which comes out of Rocky Mountain National Park, flooded, say 40 years ago. And it was a horrible flash flood. Killed people, destroyed lots of property, went all the way out into the eastern plains of Colorado. That flood repeated itself about 4 years ago. But the devastation and the death toll was less, but the devastation and the property damage was tenfold. Now, why is that? Because
It got redeveloped.
more people have moved in,
Yeah.
more houses have been built, more buildings have been constructed, there's more business, there's more infrastructure, more highways, more power lines, more everything. And we don't think about that as we grow and prosper as a nation, that we need to be prepared for, and I'm so glad you used the term all hazards, that we need to be prepared for all hazards, whether that's a man-made disaster, a natural disaster, or even a terrorist event.
So Justin,
Context and response.
yeah, so with respect to
Yeah.
Hurricane Katrina particularly, I'm thinking of the public narrative piece of this, you know, and because I asked, like, what lessons did we learn? What have we still not learned? And what I'm thinking is, has that damage still endured of what people perceive of FEMA because of Katrina?
Sure. I'll get into messaging in just a moment. Thank you for the question, and thank you for that context, sir. I think that it's also important to understand that Katrina happened 20 years ago this year, right? This is the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina. And when you think about this very moment that we're in, and we can probably get into the headlines later about what's happening to the agency, I fear that in this moment, we actually haven't learned a lot. We haven't learned a lot because it's not being taken into consideration and put into action. Because when you think about what happened 20 years ago in the formation of the Department of Homeland Security, in which FEMA was pulled and put under, right? A lot of other things kind of happened to the agency at that time, right? They kind of started to mess around with FEMA's response capabilities. It turned into largely a grant-making agency.
Oh, interesting.
And what's also true is that the focus on all hazard kind of started to go away. And the focus around terrorist attacks with grant making before disaster, remember that before disaster thing I mentioned? It started to prioritize terrorist attacks, which it should. That's great. The challenge is we are an all-hazard country, and in that all hazards threaten human life and our ability to thrive. And so we stopped doing all hazards in the same way that we historically done. And so no question a Katrina happened because those investment dollars to mitigate those risks, like seawalls that are stable and modern, weren't in place. And so when you think about what's happening now at the agency, I question, the decision makers who are completely dismantling the agency, staff are hemorrhaging, right? All these things are happening to the very agency that is meant to be the the go button response for the federal government in the middle of a crisis when states and locals don't have the capacity to do it on their own, when they need that support mechanism in place. And so I think that the last 20 years, the agency has really learned its lesson. And what's true about emergency management, I'm a true emergency manager. You learn after every crisis, right? It doesn't always go well, and you learn and you solve problems and you fill gaps to make it better the next time. That is true at all levels of emergency management. Remember, FEMA isn't its own thing. We're part of a whole emergency management infrastructure, emergency managers at the local level, the state level, in territories, and within 574 at least federally recognized tribal nations. And so this whole system works to solve problems, to learn and be better. And I'm really proud of the agency in the last 4 years with the workforce and really prioritizing people. Actually asking the question, what happened to you? What didn't you like? I worked at FEMA. Having criticism is not new. Like, I'm used to having criticism. Who here has heard something bad about FEMA? Raise your hand. That's less hands than I thought it would be. You know, we have to be real about this and realize that I represent an agency in the 4 years that I had the honor of serving with FEMA across my heart to also represent the bad that happened in the past, to just be bold enough and brave enough to have the conversation, regardless of Republican, Democrat, rich, poor, with everyone, to say what didn't go well, what do you need, and then start to operationalize based on what they need, not a bunch of people in DC.
And does that institutional memory stay in with the organization? I mean,
I think we were on a path to do that. I think that a lot of the work that happened even before I got there was doing that, with a lot of our focus around nonprofits. Disasters don't happen with just government in the response. Right. You need nonprofits, you need the private sector, you need everyone, right? You need Mary Jo down the street. Like, everyone is a participant in not only preparing for disaster, but responding to them. Yeah. And so the agency really operationalized a lot of that work. I fear now, in this world of maybe facts aren't true, and you can easily just say, well, we're going to do away with a lot of the infrastructure that we created at the federal level to help advance the whole industry forward, and be a mechanism to respond to what the industry needs, is not there. So I question what happens moving forward.
Yeah, I think we all do. And I mean, I will have a question for you on that. Mayor, I do want to kind of connect what Justin just said to, you know, what you were faced with Hurricane Helene and the rampant disinformation campaign that happened, which caused mayors on both sides of the aisle to go on television and beg people to stop. There were conspiracy theorists that accused the government of abandoning residents in need. They sowed seeds of mistrust, you know, made it worse for the first responders, actually. What was your observation of that? Can you just tell us a little bit about what happened? And then Justin, I don't know if you would have a response as well.
Well, first of all, I think when you get down to the level, say, of a municipality, most people have not interacted with FEMA before, and thank God that they haven't, because they haven't had a disaster. So that's a little bit foreign to them. I will tell you that in Western North Carolina, Hickory Nut Gorge, which is Lake Lure and Chimney Rock Village, the FEMA people who came and interacted with the community, the people who live in the community, were just exceptional. We have probably a little bit older population, particularly in Lake Lure, and so people very glibly said, well, you can do your personal assistance online, just do it online, we're done, do it online. That doesn't work with a lot of people who are maybe in their 70s and 80s, right? And so FEMA set up, and this is just anecdotal, a personal assistance place to go to at the grocery store, Ingles grocery store. And they sat there with every single person who came in and walked them through doing their personal assistance application. And I think things like that go a long way to help people understand that the people who work for FEMA have a good mission and they truly care about it. Because when you've asked somebody over and over and over, but are you sure you want to check that box? Are you sure you don't want to check that box? But this was so important. We were very fortunate in Lake Lure, there was no loss of life. And what you're talking about being prepared, I attribute that to the fact you could not have prepared for this type of hurricane in North Carolina in the mountains. You would never, anyone, I've lived in way before Katrina, every Carla, you name it, every hurricane that there is, you could not possibly have known the speed and the force with which the water came. And it is due to the water. It was not the wind, it was this just gigantic mass of water. Boulders coming down the Broad River bigger than fire engines. trees that were 150 feet tall just coming down like missiles. I mean, this was just complete devastation. And yet we had no one who lost their life. And that was because of our emergency management plan and for our first responders there who went door to door, not once, but over and over and over, making sure that everyone was safe. So I think there's a little bit of a disconnect sometimes. People's interaction with the people who are FEMA, everyone that we have interacted with, far higher than just the people doing mainly in public assistance. They've been very interested. They've been very supportive. They've done everything that they can one-on-one. So I think it is too bad when people make, and so much of it, it's not so political as I think it is. It's just to be sensationalistic about the reporting and try to drum up a real negative opinion about what FEMA is or is not doing without truly understanding what they do. Is the process too long? It is. We, small municipalities, Lake Laura has a budget of $9 million annually, okay? We spent $1.6 million in the first 3 weeks because we couldn't, there was no way for people, the roads had 20 feet of debris on them. So we had to hire local contractors and local contractors have to be paid, obviously. Right. So that's sort of given money that FEMA will reimburse that money to you because you've already expended it for emergency things. And yet this is 6 months later and we still don't have the $1.6 million. And I make that point, not to accuse FEMA of anything, but it's the process by which the money gets appropriated and it's obligated by FEMA and then it goes to the state and it's here and it's there. The problem is, you know, our town is probably looking at 40% reduction in revenue for at least the next year. Well, when you pile that on top of the $1.6 million that we haven't, there's a point at which towns just go bankrupt. So there has to be something about that process, and that's not FEMA per se, and I think that's what's hard for people to understand. It's the process by which money is, you know, it is appropriated by the Congress, it's obligated by FEMA, it's distributed though by the state, who's gonna pay the cost share, all those things are the things that mean nobody in Western North Carolina has gotten any money yet. But that is really good news to put out to talk about how bad FEMA is, to be honest with you.
It makes
it's
headlines.
Not FEMA, it's the
Right.
process.
Right.
Well, I think
And it
that
further
goes-
politicizes.
And that goes back to, I think, in that emergency management cycle you talk about.
Yeah.
That one thing that I know you understand, but you didn't use the word, and that is the media. They're part of that cycle also. And they have a role, and I think they sometimes don't handle their role correctly in really, I mean, it's easy to focus on the one FEMA individual that happens to do something bad or doesn't do something right, and then they complain to a local newspaper, and then next thing you know, a cable channel's there covering that one bad story, while there's 99 other FEMA people that are doing great jobs, and that does not get covered. Because that's not, you know, it's not bleeding, so it's not leading. So I think that media has to be a part of that cycle. And that was one of the lessons that we learned from Katrina, was that if you didn't include the media in what was going on, they were going to report just what they wanted to report, whether it was true or not.
And Justin, so can you connect this to, so you were on the ground in North Carolina, and I think there were FEMA officials who were doxxed and harassed. Mm-hmm. And I mean, this is all ties together, right, with the perception of what people think FEMA does or doesn't do. And these frontline responders are paying the impact. Can you describe what happened?
Yeah, and to be fair, I was on the ground after the initial response. I wasn't there on the initial response, although the FEMA administrator was there and others were embedded with first responders and our FEMA teams across the board. You know, it's also true that the world is changing and the media landscape is changing. And who remembers, I'm going to go back a little bit so that it makes sense to go forward as a student of history. Who remembers, raise your hand if you remember the Ohio train derailment. Yeah. So, you know, the FEMA administrator, Deanne Criswell, gave a speech in which she talked about how we were there, the state of Ohio was there, and Russia was there. There was actually an analysis done by the AP that found that a lot of the misinformation that was happening on the ground was connected to the Kremlin. It takes rumors that naturally happen. The strategy is taking rumors that naturally happen in a disaster. Rumors always kind of come up in a disaster. People like me work really, really hard to push those rumors down because information is a lifeline. I care less about the political optics and the framing of PR. I care about, and people like me care about, making sure people know where water is, making sure people know where to go get safety and to stay alive. That is my #1 priority as a communicator in crisis. And when you have foreign adversaries in your business making that difficult, that's a threat. Who remembers the Hawaii wildfire? Catastrophic. The fire literally burned perpendicularly across the community so fast, and everyone was trained for hearing their emergency alert to run up the mountain because they had trained for tsunami, not to run in the water because if they run up the mountain, they would have run into fire. It was catastrophic, and the fire was spread by an offshore hurricane that made the fire worse. We were there, the state of Hawaii was there, so was China. It's the first time we believe that China was using a misinformation campaign during our government's response to a crisis. Why? To sow division and to make things more chaotic. We got intelligence during Hurricane Helene that our bad actor friends, Russia, China, and Cuba were actually working to do the same thing in North Carolina and other states that were impacted by both Hurricane Helene and Milton. So when you think about information, it's not. These aren't natural rumors that come up in a disaster. This is something far more dangerous, and I suspect will become part of a playbook moving forward.
And so you had colleagues who were doxxed.
So I had colleagues that I had to take off working and have security detail for a week because there was legitimate concerns because they were a spokesperson and they were attacked for being Jewish and being a person who was making money off of the federal government and was actually trying to hurt people in North Carolina. And that was such a credible threat because not only was her information released publicly, her husband's information, where they live, but their parents who live in other states were also getting their information released publicly. The threat against this one particular employee was so extreme that the security detail was there because threats of bombings and other murders and things were happening at the time. Devastating stuff. We were getting FEMA employees that were getting swatted. Who knows what swatting is? Oh, yeah. Raise your hand. For those of you who don't know what swatting is, basically someone calls the police and say something really bad is happening at your house, and like a gazillion SWAT cars come beeline to your house, and all the bells and whistles of first responders come knocking at your door, freaking you out and your neighbors out. This happened around the clock. Sadly, to a lot of people who were Jewish at the agency or perceived to be Jewish at the agency, and they were a target. They were a target.
Mayor Pritchett, did you deal with this at all in terms, so not the doxing necessarily, but like the information, how to get information to your constituents right when the crisis hit? Like, how did you think about that? And
well, when it actually hit, so Friday morning, okay, unfortunately, we had no cell service. So there was really no way to communicate with anyone. I was fortunate because I had Starlink at my home and had had it for about 6 months. So I had every day 50 people at my house starting about 5 o'clock in the morning to try to be able to contact their family members, to try to find out what's going on in the outside world. We had no water, we had no sewer, we had no electricity. Plus the bridge to the road that comes in to where I live and for 200 other people up there was completely blown out. So everyone was completely isolated. So it was a problem in the beginning. It was very difficult to communicate with anyone. And so in a lack of communication, then of course things like this will arise. And I hate to see Western North Carolina painted in such a negative vein, I will tell you. Certainly there were some bad actors there. And we certainly know that the people who did make threats, against the FEMA people, they certainly did. Our police and the county sheriff's department did everything they could to deal with that. But there are going to be bad actors everywhere, to be honest with you. And when people are in a disaster, they are panic-stricken, they are angry, they try to identify someone that they can be angry with. If the only people that they see is FEMA, then that's who they'll blame it on. They blame it on our fire department. Our fire department was maligned all over the United States for what they did. So I think you have to be careful. I think you said that the media plays a huge role in how these disasters are handled, because in the lack of people being able to communicate with each other and get the truth out, then what's going to go out, and not just locally or not just in the state, but nationally. You see national assessments of what's going on specifically in Lake Lure, though the people have never been there, to be honest with you. So we've never had any problem with FEMA people there. We love FEMA, we love everybody there. Everybody's been great, but that's not what's presented. So I think you need to take with a grain of salt always, but particularly in times of a disaster, what you read. Is there any actual data to support what's being said, positive or negative? So I think that's one thing, we learned. We had to go on a very positive public communications campaign, because you have to do something to refute. We had, for instance, I'll just give you anecdotally, our fire department, our assistant fire chief and our fire chief too, was receiving death threats. His family, his children were receiving death threats. People calling his house, sending Facebook, hundreds of thousands of entries on social media that I should fire him, okay, because what he was not doing, but otherwise he should be killed. Called his son and said, your father should be shot, should be hung. So these are things that I think we have to all recognize. These things crop up out of a lot of people who don't have any association whatsoever with that particular disaster.
They're weaponizing the disaster for their own.
They are. And so, you have to learn to deal with that. You have to learn to help the community understand what's going on. We just put on a massive positive campaign on social media. We have a great communications director there, just trying to make sure that there's more positive things going out than there are negative. And the having no cell service, that's a problem in our community that we're dealing with. That, unfortunately, we have been trying to get a cell tower in Lake Lure now since I've been mayor, which was 5.5 years. And it has been delayed for one reason and another, the Historical Preservation Society being one thing, because they felt it would be obtrusive to people. That's very hard when
You'll get it now, won't you?
Well, as I used to tell them, we've had instances where our fire department and our emergency management department could not respond to 911 calls, and people died because the call got bounced to other counties. So you recognize that more keenly in the time of a disaster, but the reality is that existed before Hurricane Helene. So it is hard to always pre-imagine everything that's going to result as part of the disaster. You just don't know. You do have to keep learning, and you have to keep adapting and changing, but you have to be on guard, I think, to think that you will ever be totally prepared for when the disaster comes, because you won't. You just really won't.
Well, that's probably definition of disaster and disaster response.
Yeah.
I'm going to go to Q&A in about 10 minutes. I have a couple more questions, so start thinking of your questions you might have for our esteemed panel. I'm thinking of Hurricane Katrina and that image that became, the image of somebody on their roof and the helicopter coming and grabbing them from the roof and just flood water everywhere around them. And that was a time that we were all consuming the same news, and we no longer are. And so then I think of the LA wildfires. I want you to talk about them in a second. I got a lot of my news from the LA wildfires from TikTok, because that's where people were, man on the street recording. And I'm just curious with all of you, like, if a disaster happens today, what's the first place you go for updates? So is it social media? Like, can you just raise your hand? Is it TikTok? So that's not everybody. Is it, I don't know, New York Times, mainstream media, most people? Is it Twitter, X? Several of you. But so, a lot of you didn't even raise your hand at all. So where are you getting your news on disasters? Tell us in the Q&A. But your last deployment was to LA.
Yeah.
And when you were talking about the fire chief, Mayor, I was thinking of the campaign against the fire chief in LA. What went wrong in the LA response? Because it really was just, we watched what we felt a disaster unfolding in addressing the disaster. So tell us from your perspective being there.
Yeah, I think what's true also, the point you made and the comments about media, certainly media has a role to play. And I remember several times a hurricane would be coming and we would call newsrooms and say, we actually need you out there aggressively to tell the story, because if you're not out there telling the story aggressively before this thing hits, we're not going to get to the people that we can get through your audiences alone. Government's not set up that way. And I felt really proud and good about that. And media was a partner in helping us do that. It was like, come after us if we're doing something wrong, like in the response or the recovery. But like right now, we like need you out there communicating to the public because you are providing a life-saving service. And so media absolutely has a critical role to play. But the point about the other platforms, no one's watching the same 5 o'clock news anymore. No one's watching CNN or Fox around the clock like they used to. We are all on the same social media platforms. We are listening to podcasts. We're listening to just watching Instagram, carousel stories, really quick quotes, and not even reading the whole story. Like, it's not only that we're not watching the same news, we're not consuming in the same way. And so when you have such a fragmented way of getting information, of course, it's true that rumors come up, but it also means that we can't rely solely on media as government or private sector or nonprofits that are doing work in disaster. We have to rely on ourselves. We have to be thinking about how are we reaching out to these content creators in a different way. Gone are the days of just working with newsrooms.
When you say we, you're talking about federal government or government?
Anyone who wants to put a message out, that's what I mean by we. Anyone, the collective we. We who want to inform, to educate, or to motivate a shift in behavior can't just rely on the traditional sources. We have to go to the person who is doing a TikTok account, who has 8 million followers and doesn't have the same infrastructure that a newsroom has of how to produce and play news, which came up in Los Angeles.
And fact-checking.
And fact-checking. And is this news, this is information that is honest? Part of this is also evolving emergency management. We like to say, share this information with your neighbors. Get information that can save someone's life to your neighbor. A neighbor-to-neighbor strategy is far more effective than you as an individual relying on very scarce resources of fire departments and other first responders. But now we have to evolve that to say, when you get information, regardless if you trust the person giving it to you, verify that it's true before you act on it, or share it to someone else. Like, we actually are in this place where we have to advance our own information gathering culture and sharing culture if we're gonna deal with this. This came up in Los Angeles. In Los Angeles, you saw a meme that had the big Hollywood sign up in flames. And of course, the tourism industry lost their minds because they're like, oh my God, people in other countries are gonna see this. They're not gonna book flights to come visit California. We need that money, those tourism dollars. And it was a lie. This wasn't true. I have no way of knowing, and I didn't get the intelligence to confirm if this was a foreign actor or not. But the misinformation was there. The misinformation.
And with the advance of AI, I mean, that's just easy to kind of put into
It's
those
easy to
channels.
happen. It's easy to happen.
Do either of you have a comment on that?
The only thing I would say is, I always talk about discerning consumers of news. And all of us have a responsibility. If we're going to be a citizen of a free and open society, where we have, the First Amendment, and we have bad actors. I get these briefings all the time about what's going on, and it's absolutely frightening. Every single person in this room, and every sphere of influence that's represented in this room, because every single one of you have a sphere of influence, have got to teach each other how to be a good discerner. Obvious, now this is going to get even worse, but were obvious to me AI-generated stories that if you paid 2 seconds attention to it, you'd recognize this was not true. But it's so easy, and everybody in this room right now is ADHD. You don't think you are, but you are. Because we look at the headline, we don't look at the headline anymore. To your point about Instagram, you look at 3 or 4 words in the headline and move on to the next story. We're at Vegas playing the one-armed bandits, except we don't have to pull the arm, we just push the button and just keep going, going, going. We've got to learn to stop and consider what we're looking at. And then think about it. Sources, credibility. Does this even really appear to be true? Have you ever thought to yourself, when you've seen a story, does that even seem like it's true? Just asking yourself that question will make you stop and think, oh, maybe I should confirm this before I share it with a friend or something. So I think the media has, and we're using the media in a very broad term here, has an even larger outsized influence now because you're the media.
Yeah.
Everybody in this room is.
And disasters are meant to prey on the vulnerable, right? And,
Oh.
and incredulous things happen. You said an entire town went into the lake that is the lifeblood of your city, you know, and so some of those things sound sensational. And so just, I think having, you know, just having a discerning eye to that, knowing that there's foreign actors and stuff is really important, not just for the disaster space, but just how we consume news.
Yes.
Now, I have time for one more question, which is that, like, you know, we're in a political moment where if we take politics out of it for a second, my question to you all is, what can we do to prepare cities and states? President Trump has said he might get rid of FEMA, or that it might move out of the Homeland Security portfolio. Michael, I think you should offer your 2 cents on, like, just the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security even. But, you know, what can we do to prepare? So I'm asking for, like, an affirmative, like, what is our plan given, you know, a lot of the troubling things that we've popped up, especially if at the federal level, FEMA's not going to have the strength or the muscularity that it has had in the past. Would you like to start?
Well, I would just say, without going into, you can certainly ask me afterwards if you want to, but the creation of the Department of Homeland Security was probably one of the largest mistakes that this government has made in the past 50 or 100 years. Humongous mistake. Trying to combine 22 departments and agencies with different disparate cultures was a huge mistake.
And that happened in the Bush administration.
And that happened during the Bush administration. President Bush was opposed to it. And we had lots of conversations in the White House about how we were going to continue to oppose it. But then Congress, you've got to remember, this is post 9/11. So everybody's scared of their shadow, even worse than we are today. And so Congress felt like it had to be seen doing something. So now this big rocks rolling down the hill called DHS. And so the Bush administration, we all try to get in front of it to create it the way we want to do it, which we attempted to do. There is now a movement afoot, and I don't know whether Justin would agree with this or not. I'm opposed to the dismantling of FEMA, but there's legislation to pull FEMA out of DHS, which I would stand up and sing the Hallelujah chorus for, because that's the singular thing we could do to strengthen FEMA. That would also, in my mind, start perhaps the deconstruction of DHS completely, which is my ultimate objective, is to get rid of all of DHS, divide it back up into its component parts, and let them operate independently as they should be. But getting FEMA out as an independent agency and doing as Bill Clinton did and make it a cabinet level agency is the proper way to do it. Because right now, FEMA is subsumed within DHS, and as Justin can tell you, is fighting every single day for every single dollar, for every single, I mean, and just his point about the grants, you know the old rule about following the money. Well, today you could put the word terrorism in any sort of grant application, send it to FEMA, because it actually wouldn't even go to FEMA, it'd go to somewhere else in DHS, and they would fund it simply because it says terrorism. Well, the response that we did on 9/11 to Lower Manhattan would have been exactly the same if those planes had been guided into the towers by a mistaken air traffic controller, or by a pilot that had passed out, or by a Cessna. Our response would have been the same.
For FEMA.
For FEMA. Would have been exactly the same.
But not for DHS and everything that came from that.
But everything that came from that has now created this huge security state and this behemoth that we call DHS, which in my opinion is totally dysfunctional to the detriment of FEMA. And that's why it needs to be deconstructed.
But, okay, take FEMA out of it. What is your rationale for why DHS should be dismantled?
Let me give you, and this will be hard for people to comprehend, but I want you to open your minds about it. Who has the greatest vested interest in making certain that a plane is not hijacked, stolen, flown into a tower, or otherwise destroyed? Who has the greatest interest in making sure that that plane is safe, yet also that their passengers are safe and on time and get from point A to point B safely? Who has the greatest vested interest in that? The airlines. The singular most important thing that was done post 9/11 was the securing of the cockpit doors, which came at the request. The airlines originally opposed it, but airlines originally bought into it. But what did we get out of that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, if
shoes
it
off,
abolishes TSA, that's
take
great.
your belt off,
All right, I have 2 minutes.
put your
Yeah, I'm
hands
sorry,
up.
I took you down a tangent, but forthcoming book on DHS,
I'm sorry,
right?
what?
I'm letting you plug your book.
Well.
If you don't want to, I'll move on. Yeah.
So kind.
I have one book out called Deadly Indifference, which is about Hurricane Katrina. But I'm in the process of doing a history of the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, because no one really understands why it was created the way it was, or what the original idea was. And what's happened now is it's created a security state that we now live in.
Yes.
The Patriot Act, everything that's a consequence, the unintended consequences, or sometimes I would argue the intended consequences of what's happened to FEMA is all because of Homeland Security.
Mayor Pritchett,
Huge
you're on the
mistake.
ground. How do we better prepare cities and states, given the current environment, political and otherwise?
Well, I think, you always have to, however good your emergency management plan is, irrespective of the size of your municipality, of your city, there are always things that you learn from one disaster. I think so. There's a huge, needs to be a huge focus on that, making sure you're as ready as you can possibly be. But there are also a lot of things, particularly in our case, that we need to look at mitigating to make sure that the effects, because there will be another hurricane. I lived in the Gulf Coast my entire life till 2011. There will be another hurricane, another disaster with another hurricane. We need to look at Lake Lure has a 5-county watershed with all the water coming in through the Broad River. That's one of the reasons that there was so much flooding there, an inordinate amount of flooding. We need to look at that. What can we do to mitigate that? What can we do to look at things differently, other than just saying, it's hard when you're downstream. That's true, I'll give you, though. Upstream, people don't care that much if the water's coming downstream. We need to look at building infrastructures that are more resilient, that can withstand the force of hurricanes. Because what we have to start looking for is you have to start preparing for when the next one comes, to be honest with you. So we need to recover from this disaster, but as we do that, we need to make sure that any of the things that we are rebuilding are built to current code, are built to withstand the things that we now could possibly happen in the future. So I think that's where we need to look.
Allude to, climate disasters, right, and adaptability to that, which hopefully we'll get to in Q&A. 30 seconds for you.
30 seconds.
How do we
I have
better
to say
equip?
really quick, everything you just said, 100%. We should take you around the country to have every mayor hear you, because it's 100% right.
Yeah, that's right.
And thank you for your leadership, Mayor. I'm a true emergency manager. I believe that emergency managers at the local level should report directly to mayors, that emergency managers at the state level should report directly to governors, and at the federal level, emergency managers should report directly to presidents. We do when there's a presidentially declared disaster now, but in steady state days like today, here in Chicago and Highland Park, we would have to work through the Department of Homeland Security. To Mr. Brown's point, I think that if this administration wanted to do something to prioritize the agency and strengthen the agency for people, pulling FEMA out of DHS would be a really interesting action that I think you'd probably get Democrats hollering and hooting in the streets.
Bipartisan agreement on the stage.
And I will say, for the record, for everyone watching, everyone here, FEMA people are not people that you want to leave the agency. If you are a person who works in disaster, that's true at FEMA and every level of emergency management, or anyone who works in disasters, whether you're a politician or not, when you look into the eye of someone who lost everything, and you don't care what their party affiliation is, you don't care what they represent or what they believe, they may believe nothing that you believe and not even connected in any way. But when you're on the other end of that person and looking them in the eye and know that they have lost everything, they've lost loved ones, their house is gone, you don't care about any of that. You care about helping them get to stability, helping them start their recovery. This is what FEMA does, and I'm shocked that there isn't action to invest more resources, to grow the workforce, to make FEMA a priority across the board, and to have that be an approach that every level of government takes. This is people's lives. These disasters are going to get worse. We haven't even talked about earthquakes. We haven't even talked about the compounding effects of disasters. There was a drought in California that created the conditions that made fire. Timber went into the ocean. And then when there was a huge storm years later, that timber that just hung out in the ocean came rushing back into the coastline and took out whole communities, right? The compounding effects of these disasters are going to take us out, y'all. And if we're not investing in emergency management at every level, starting with FEMA and modeling what leadership and success looks like, and how do you grow talent and bring every Chicago student into this profession to help our nation moving forward, it's not going to go well.
Good pitch. With that, Chicago students, questions, please line up at either of the mics.
Hello, my name is Alex Fuentes. I'm a second year at the college, and we touched a bit about social media and how individual creators are increasingly a part of the news communication pipeline. So my question is, what regulations can be passed by governments, and what can social media companies increasingly do to combat the lack of journalistic integrity and journalistic training that some of these individuals have compared to traditional news organizations?
Well, I have a thing where I like to get to all questions, so not everybody has to answer all questions.
Your question assumes that social media companies are a news organization. They're not, they're just a platform. So it's the responsibility of every single user of that platform. And then I think the platform owners themselves they're the ones that have a responsibility to monitor content. That's not the government's role. These are just platforms.
Do you agree or disagree? Do you have a response?
My quick response is, I think that if we're going to have conversation about what policies and regulations we need a whole lot more conversation at every level to understand implications and application to understand what that's going to look like for our community and our democracy moving forward. But it's an important conversation to be had, and it's not happening.
Yeah. It is.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I'm a second year at the college. My question is, given that prevention is so key both to preventing loss of life and saving a ton of money when disasters do strike, with the way in sort of ahead of planned budget cuts to basically every level of government, how do we incentivize disaster preparedness at the local and state level?
How do we incentivize it? Mayor Pritchett, can we start with you?
Well, I think part of the realization is that, the recovery from disaster has to include looking forward and deciding what's going to keep the same thing from happening again. Because whatever you do to mitigate the disaster to your community as a result of this particular disaster, you're just setting yourself up for it to happen again. It's going to be costly. There's going to be more loss of life. So I think there needs to be an understanding that has to be part of emergency management planning. And I think emergency management planning usually just focuses on what are we going to do in the time of a disaster. And the part after that is what are we going to do to make sure this doesn't happen again. That has to be incorporated into all emergency management programs. And all entities, municipalities, cities, towns are required by their state to have emergency management programs. So that's certainly something that could be implemented by the state and requiring that be a big part of what they're doing.
Thank you.
Really quick. Sorry, I can't help it. I can't help it. Emergency managers love, it's a little criticism of their own profession, love to give every person every bit of information to get prepared, and we end up overwhelming everyone with all the information to get prepared, and we're not thinking about it in terms of human behavior. So I actually think that we need to be looking at strategies done in public health and other ways of marketing campaigns, and how do you actually reach people and get them to not only understand something, but get them to change their behavior because of it. It is expensive to do that. It's also very intentional. Really proud at FEMA the last 4 years, really integrated strategies to do that. Cultural competency work, accessibility work. How can you ask whole communities to do something and know something if we're not even speaking in their language or reflecting their backgrounds, right? So it's one size fits all messaging has got to go. It has never worked for anyone, and understanding who are the people you're trying to connect with and message to them. Really quick point, to prove my point, in a disaster, when everyone gets those alerts to evacuate, data shows that people need to get that information about 7 times before they actually take the action of leaving their homes. And that's when there's fire coming and it's really bad, right? And so if that's true in a crisis, then communicating to someone today about what they need to do for something to happen tomorrow, forget about it in the way the system is built today.
And I will say, just to add to that, I think one of the things looking forward, we need to look as a country at the age of our infrastructure and the deterioration of our infrastructure separately from disasters, not in times of disasters. There's so much infrastructure in our country that needs to be either rehabilitated or renewed or built to a different code so that when the disaster comes, we're ready for it.
We had a bill in the administration before that did that, and it went away.
Please.
Hi, my name is Madeline, and I'm a first year in the college. In a field that's hopefully bipartisan, such as emergency management, how do you mix a bipartisan response to a disaster with an unfortunately partisan issue such as climate change, which makes these disasters worse?
Very good question.
I'll take it.
Can you tell he was a spokesperson?
Sorry, can't help it. I believe in climate change. I am less concerned whether you do, and I'm more concerned about taking the actions to mitigate the risk. FEMA's job and the work that we were doing and the work of emergency management is to make sure that we're having conversations to take the action to help keep people safe before disaster, during disaster, and after disaster. Others can have the debates on other things that they want. Go for it. Go on with your bad self. But our job needs to be, what are the hazards, all the hazards? We haven't even talked about cyber. We haven't talked really about alien infrastructure. All of these things are going to have compounding effects and impact us in a big way. We need to prioritize the conversation about the risk. What is the risk? What do we need to do to help mitigate that risk and make sure that we keep that conversation happening in our communities? We can't get fooled or distracted by the politics of the day. It will just put us on the wrong path.
And just to counter that, so I believe in climate change, but I don't think it's anthropogenic. Climate change naturally occurs all the time. It's always changing. What we need to do, to your point, is not focus on we need to look at the pre-disaster mitigation risks. To all of these points about what kind of resilient infrastructure do we have, or to a publicly traded company that's building a new building, an office building in Chicago. How do you make that building more resilient to all the disasters that could potentially occur in downtown Chicago? You take climate change out of it and focus on the risks. And I think that
I think you're both kind of saying the same thing, just differently. Yeah, but yeah.
I know we're saying the same thing. But she was putting the context of man-made climate change, and I'm saying you and I are probably on the opposite side.
I'm not even going to comment about your climate change.
We have 5 minutes and we have 2 more questions. But one thing, Michael, you bring up is what is the role of private sector in all of this who get impacted? That's for the next panel, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Owen. I'm a 4th year. Thank you for talking to us. I have 2 questions for you. The first one is your whole discussion of sort of misinformation and sensationalization, I agree is bad, but I think the politicization of natural disasters is probably good because they're a bad thing. So I guess I want to ask you, what do you think a more generative politics around natural disasters might look like? And second of all, I wanted to ask, in this more generative politics around natural disasters, do we need to include nature and the non-human to say maybe we don't need to be developing in these certain places because it's just not tenable to do that? Mm-hmm. Maybe a little bit radical, but.
I like it, but hold on, I'm going to take the last question, and then you all will just have a chance to respond to all 3, please.
Okay, hi, I'm Devin, I'm a first year in the college. My question was relatively similar. I was going to ask if you guys think the politicization of the disasters has been an ultimately net positive thing because it's brought more attention, or if it's been a net negative thing, and kind of how you weigh these, and if it is a net negative thing, how should we change how we talk about it, and how can we?
Mayor, can we start with you since they've been dominating? So a generative politics that what a generative politics might look like?
It's hard to say. Yes. So I certainly think you're never going to get away from politicizing disasters. You can. It's a natural reaction by the people who are in whatever power base they're in to be caught by surprise and trying to blame it. It's just part of human nature. Everybody's always going to blame it on whoever was there before, right? And so it's always easy to say, well, if these people had done that, we would have been better prepared for this disaster. And the new people who are there, and we're not even talking about, so in our particular state as an example, we had a change of governors too, but they were both Democrats. It was one governor to another governor, so it wasn't a change of parties if you're talking about that being political. right? So, but there was a change of leadership there, and so there was just a natural tendency for people to say, well, that should have been done by my predecessor, and then to say, well, I can't really get started on this yet because we experienced this. I think we need to figure out, in my opinion, to depoliticize disasters in a negative way, and instead look at it as how do we as a country need to deal with disasters. That is going to involve being political. That's going to be involving the federal government, the state government, the county government, the parish government, municipalities. So all those things are political. We need that. We just need to quit trying to blame it on somebody and try to figure out what it is we're going to do to fix it.
Who wants to go next?
I would just add that I think that the biggest driver of that, of what the mayor was just saying, is the private sector. I think the NGOs, the nonprofits, and the private sector can drive that. Because again, going back to who has the vested interest in that, people that hold the mortgages, people that manage the office buildings, people that build the highways. Even though the government may pay for it, they hire a contractor to do it. It's the private sector, I think, that can help depoliticize it in a positive way.
I agree with that.
I would just add, politics that works to disrupt and distract and divide, there's no room for that in disaster. But politics working to help show government showing up for people, to the point I made before. There's no politics in this work because there has to be actually because of people, right? That was the point I made. People need to see a press conference with their mayor, their governor, and the FEMA administrator and president, who better if they come from all different parties. Like, I had the pleasure of working in red states and blue states and purple states and seeing phenomenal examples of political leadership from all political spectrums in those states, where people put their own agendas aside and said, we're going to show government working for people, because when people are in chaos, they want to see government working for them. That's necessary and urgent. To the point about moving communities and not building in certain communities, if you want to talk about political will and the lack of it, it is that issue. I think that this country isn't having the conversation about resilience in the way that we need to. True resilience. What are we going to do to make sure that we are truly going to mitigate the risks that are already happening, are going to continue to grow, and take big, bold action to solve problems and to strengthen, not to destroy and dismantle.
I agree.
Well said. Well, thanks to all of you for being here today. Please join me in thanking our panel for this wonderful discussion.
It was good.
See you at the next IOP event.
Thank you.